Welcome to today's meeting of the Children, Education and Communities Policy and Scrutiny Committee Task Group for the School Holiday Food Scrutiny Review. My name's Jane Mellor and I'm the Democracy Officer for this meeting. And I need to take any nominations for the chair.
I'll nominate Simon, Councillor Daubeny.
Thank you, Councillor Fitzpatrick. And can it be seconded?
Happy to second that.
Thank you, Councillor Fenton. So is it all agreed for Councillor Daubeny to be elected chair?
Agreed.
Okay. Councillor Daubeny.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jane and colleagues. You'll be aware that despite the relaxation recently in COVID regulations and restrictions, today's non-decision making scrutiny meetings are being held remotely, pending an imminent review of these arrangements. I'll move on to item 2 on the agenda. Do we have any declarations of interest, please? No? Okay. There'll be no registrations for public participation. So I'll move on. Welcome everyone, especially to those viewing the meeting via the online link. This afternoon, this task group is considering a draft scoping report for a school holiday food scrutiny review in response to a request from the Council's Executive made in September 2021 for the Children, Education and Communities CEC Policy and Scrutiny Committee to consider the effectiveness, impact and funding of the free school meal voucher scheme alongside other grassroots community-based provision and other schemes to address food poverty impacts and bring back any recommendations. We shall consider a report from Pauline Stutchfield, Director of Customer and Communities, which sets the context around the solutions to address school holiday hunger that have been available throughout the pandemic, which are due to come to an end, and the work plan to address food poverty impacts in the city in the longer term. The committee task group members are asked to consider and comment on the draft scope and objectives of the review and agree next steps. This is to inform developing council plans to support residents struggling to provide food for children during school holidays. Pauline, can I ask you now to present your report, concluding with a scope for discussion and delivery timescales, please?
Certainly, Chair, thank you. So the report on the agenda really sets out the objective of the review. So normally for a scrutiny, you probably be setting your own objectives and scope, but that's been set. The objective has been set by executive. And the bulk of the report then gives you the context behind the issues that have been raised and the problem that is to be solved around the long-term solutions around holiday hunger, given that it costs £50,000 per week to issue the holiday school vouchers to those children on free school meals, and that is a significant financial pressure for the council. And the other predominant issue is the impact of the pandemic on the financial position of many families, and going forward some of the cost of living pressures that will be felt by families across the city. And a lot of the support mechanisms that have been in place for families throughout COVID will be starting to come to an end now. And then and certainly the test and trace payments, for example, have already finished, and the household support grant, which covers food and fuel funding, is due to come to an end at the end of this month, and that follows in September last year the end of furlough and the end of the £20 per week universal credit supplement. And on top of that, obviously, there's then the social issues arising from the pandemic and the pressures that have been brought about around health and social inclusion, which are significant. And of course, our universal credit claimant numbers are currently still twice as high as they were at the beginning of the pandemic. So all of that is outlined on page 3 in paragraphs 10 and 11. As further context to the report, then it talks about, from paragraph 12 onwards, the free school meal school holiday voucher provision, the history behind it from March 2019, and where this all started, really, where the government tried to put in place something to mitigate the impacts of children being at home instead of school during the term, and they started to issue food vouchers. And that was followed on by some pressure to continue that scheme, which it did partially through 2020. But then due to really a significant pressure from both celebrities but also local authorities to continue to fund that through whatever mechanisms local authorities could find, and generally that's been through COVID funded grants and or council's own emergency funding, and as you can see from the table on agenda page 5 going on to agenda page 6, certainly the funding of those vouchers has come through a mix of funding for the council, which comes to an end in this financial year. Just taking you back slightly there in terms of the numbers of children we're talking about, the table at paragraph 13 on agenda page 4 shows you the significant increases in numbers, and we expect that to have continued in the last 6 months, but we're waiting for the figures to come out, which are due out next week. So we'll certainly provide those figures for you at future meetings of this task group. But as you can see, certainly in secondary school, the numbers have gone up by 30% in terms of children claiming free school meals. Then the report goes on to talk about what other arrangements are in place to support families during the holidays, and we have details in the report and attached at the annex of the holiday activities and food programme. And the Scrutiny Committee received an update at its January meeting on the progress in delivering that programme, and the minutes of that meeting are contained on agenda page 7. And I think it's fair to say over time there has been more engagement with that scheme, and the funding for half, in light of the recommendations of the National Food Strategy, has now been extended for 3 years, and that funding includes resources. So a half officer will be recruited within the communities team to deliver that programme going forward. There is also information for you in Annex B around the food bank statistics. This is not, this doesn't give you information about what happens during the school holidays, but this is a facility that is available to residents year round. And we have got the quarterly statistics back to January 2019. If the task group wants that information, so that you can see trends over time in terms of food bank support, and you can see how we can break down that data in the annex, and that again can be used along with grant information to produce maps and tables for you to review in terms of identifying where the need is across the city. The report also talks about other grassroots support. We've got a range of informal arrangements across the city within communities, and our communities officers are close to many of those facilities. They range from pop-up food banks to pay-as-you-feel cafes and other forms of food distribution. It also talks about the community hubs and the work that they've done over the pandemic to support residents in need of food. And then the final bit of background information from paragraph 23 onwards on page 8 is the detail behind the council motion on residents' right to food and how we intend to progress the activities identified in that motion, which was approved by full council in October. And again, a food officer will be recruited to sit alongside the HAF officer to deliver some of the work, particularly around a network of food resources across the city. Part of that work will be to identify the data available and the need. So certainly reflects the some of the items that are mentioned in the scope for this report. Something that is not in the report, because I've continued to research information that might be useful for you. There is the National Food Strategy. There is the recent JRF report, 2022.
I think you're on mute, Pauline.
Sorry, when did I go on mute? Which bit did I get to?
It's in the JRF report.
All right, fantastic. Not too far then. And then there's the Marmot review, which was undertaken, public health review that was undertaken 10 years ago. And there's an update report that was published last year. And Maxine Squire, the AD responsible for education and skills, passed me a report this morning. And this is by the Centre for Social Justice, and that's a briefing on free school meals and holiday hunger. And in that report, it does talk about the fact that the school meal vouchers solution for school holidays was a short-term solution, and should not be understood as a long-term solution. Not only is the system inefficient and open to abuse through secondary black markets, it also removes responsibility from parents for feeding their children and denies them agency. There may be a purely financial element to the wider question of child food poverty, but it also revolves around deeper needs, such as for nutritional education, parenting support, support with personal spending, and social issues such as addiction and indebtedness. And that it also comes up with some of those longer term solutions, which it might be useful for the task group to consider. And then moving to page 9, there are some suggestions for the scope of the work that members may wish to pursue in order to achieve the objective of the scrutiny review, and they are laid down in items A to I, and those suggestions have come through communities officers, but also through Maxine as well in education. And in there you will see an opportunity to derive some data back from the success or otherwise of the food voucher scheme by undertaking a survey, which Maxine could organise on your behalf. Probably not a significant one, but certainly through a school rather than the council undertaking it themselves. But particularly as schools are the ones that are holding the information about who were given school vouchers, not ourselves. And then there's a time scale there in paragraph 28 as well, and really needing to report before the summer if it's going to have any effect on moving forward, given the pressures on families that we've already talked about and the ending of support in the short term. Was that okay, Councillor Daubeny as chair?
Thank you, Pauline. That's very comprehensive. I'm sure we'll have questions for you as how we move forward. Any questions there for Stephen or Fiona? Councillor Fenton. Sorry.
Just a quick question around around half the holiday activities and food programme. So I know we heard at the January meeting a report back on how that scheme had gone. Do we have any sense, either from our own experience or from elsewhere, whether we, regardless of what happens on the vouchers front, whether we're anticipating an increase in take up of that programme? Because I know when we discussed it in January, we heard that if a greater proportion of children and families had sort of taken up the half offer, then that might have put pressures in terms of the ability to deliver that service for all eligible children. So I wondered whether there was any further sort of intelligence or information on the basis of what as we learn about the impact of the HAF programme.
I think it's grown over time, but the fact that we're going to get resource in to coordinate this work rather than it being done as an addition to someone's already full-time role will allow the capacity to fully focus on that objective, which is to make it as effective as possible. And of course, a lot of this is commissioning work with the third sector to deliver programs across different settings. And that will mean different things in different communities. And again, that needs coordination and promotion as well. And again, there'll be more resource to be able to do that, working hand in hand with the other food officer as well, getting the benefit of having other food networks involved in the delivery of support during school holidays, perhaps will lead to more coordination. So we'd hope to get some of those benefits out from simply having the capacity in the council to start to coordinate all of that.
Just a quick, thank you for that, Pauline. A quick follow-up. When do you expect those two new posts to be filled?
If you just bear with me, I should have an email in my inbox. Just bear with me. We have JD's designed already. The approval for the post, the food post was in the last 2 weeks, and the process of advertising will follow as soon as those JDs have been scored for payroll purposes, for grading purposes, and then they'll be advertised.
That sounds fairly soon, Pauline. Thank you for that. Councillor Fitzpatrick, you put your hand up and it went again. So,
no, I wasn't sure whether we were doing it informally or formally through hands up. So,
well, I think because we're being filmed, as it were. So,
right, okay. So, shall I speak now then? Yeah.
Please do. Yes.
Okay. Well, just a pedantic point to start with, under implications at the end. I do get slightly annoyed on the equalities one when it says, often says in council reports, there are no equalities implications. I mean, I think the basis of what we're talking about here is inequality in the broadest sense. So I would want us to bear that in mind when we do anything or when anything final comes through. There are implications for equalities. We're talking about inequality here across the piece. So there's that. Secondly, Councillor Fenton and I were at a meeting last week where we heard from community hubs around the country about the work that they do and how they operate. And we had quite a revelation from the last speaker from Essex, who talked about funding to do with family funds, and she talked about the work that they were doing. And I think we were quite sort of surprised by this. We hadn't realised that there had been opportunities to apply for funding And it clearly does relate and work alongside what we're talking about. Moira was there, Moira Scaife, and Moira said, yes, that was the case. Money had been applied for. I don't know whether Councillor Fenton wants to say any more about that, but I just wonder, Pauline, do you know about this? And does it have any relevance to what we're talking about here is the first thing I wanted to ask. So can I ask that?
I don't know the answer to that question, Councillor Fitzpatrick, but of course Maura can support the work of this task group as well, so we can bring all funding streams in. And one of the things that I was suggesting that we map the application of any funding across the city as well, and the take up of funding, and that may feed into that particular proposal, but I can't talk about that currently. Just on equalities, obviously this report is not a decision-making report, and absolutely you're right. What we should be doing, or my support to you as officer, is that we start to construct the equalities impact assessment throughout this review, so that it's ready to go sit alongside your recommendations to executive, and it's complete at the end, and that we're not doing it as a tick back box at the end of the process. So we start to identify some of the issues and barriers that we would seek to want to overcome with this work.
Thank you. Chair, can I just ask you then that maybe a conversation is had with Moira Scaife to find out exactly what is happening in terms of applications for any funding, national funding, and a person was named to us in the meeting we had last week, a person from within City of York Council. The name escapes me, but there is somebody employed who would be applying for this funding, and it does have relevance. So I wonder, Chair, if we could leave that with you to investigate that further.
So who is dealing with applications for national funding?
Yes.
Lovely. Okay, can we have a look at the paragraph 27 and consider the list we have there, as well as the other material in the report overall? Are we happy to move ahead with this, or do you want to alter it or add to it anyway? Councillor Fenton.
Yeah, I was just picking up Councillor Fitzpatrick's point under
Yes, of course.
point G, analysis of available national and local funding of initiatives. I think in the conversations we were having last week, it was in the context of the family hub model, which Maura was telling us about, and which, as Councillor Fitzpatrick said, the authority has has bid for some funding. So hopefully we could pick that up under item G in terms of funding that is either available that we've secured or potentially available that we've bid for. So that is potentially another string to our bow. I'd probably just add, looking down the list of tasks under H, best practice elsewhere. Pauline mentioned a report from the Commission for Social Justice. I think Pauline mentioned it would be, if we can expand that point H, best practice from elsewhere, to include any sort of academic research or research by those organisations, which, because they will have done hopefully an analysis of best practice. So rather than us reinvent the wheel, we can just learn from the work that they've done in terms of, from the extract that Pauline read out, they seem to have undertaken an analysis, whether it's sort of desk-based or field-based, an analysis of the voucher scheme and its impact and its sort of potential future evolution. So it'd be useful for us to see that.
Thank you.
But that's fine.
I think, Pauline, when this first came to committee back in January that we were going to do a review, you mentioned that you could send us a list of officers who could help us in the work. Can we now begin to assign some of these to officers? We can then work with them to shape the report as it begins to come together.
Yes, Chair, certainly.
Great, thank you.
Can I just correct the title of the report? It's by the Centre for Social Justice.
All right, not the commission, but the centre.
No, yeah.
Yep.
Can I just say on that I agree, totally agree with Councillor Fenton in what he suggested there. And for us, of course, in York, with Joseph Rowntree, with the foundation being based here, it's easier to sometimes have the in-person meetings that we might want to have going forward, given that we're moving in that direction now. I think we're quite well placed to be able to take advantage of advice rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So I would agree with that under H.
I mean, we anything else before I move on to paragraph 29? Any other thoughts? I mean, obviously this is a scope for discussion, but we could add to it later, I'm sure, as things begin to evolve and materialize as we work through this scope. Any thoughts, Stephen?
I think we probably don't want to outface ourselves to.
No,
this is
there's a lot here.
And yeah, we know that we're you know, there is a deadline, and there's a good reason for the deadline, which is the money runs out.
Yeah.
So I think that I think if we approach it from the perspective of identifying the absolutely critical pieces of information that we we do need in order to understand the historic need, existing need, and potentially the future need, as well as the academic information that Pauline set out around the effectiveness of the system that has been in place up to now. Because again, going back to looking at what we've been asked to look at, the effectiveness, the impact, and the funding of the voucher scheme. So hopefully there's some information we can draw on to help us better understand that. But then the more tricky bit is alongside other grassroots community-based provision, which is kind of necessarily disparate, and about which we may have more information about some of that provision than others.
Yes.
Through our own personal involvement in some activities, but that's probably trickier, and I think that's where conversations with some of Pauline's colleagues, Maura being one of them, who has a really a good grasp of what is happening on the ground in various communities. You know, and I'm also conscious that it is an issue that affects all communities in the cities. Yes, there are obviously there's much greater need in some communities than others, and the figures at the back of the report highlight that. But it is something that we, as far as possible, we need to have a good grasp of what the situation is in all communities where it's an issue.
Can I say something on that
Please.
as well?
Please do.
My experience of schools, etc., and having done scrutiny topics around the city, around meals previously, is to ensure that we do work closely with YSAB, the schools forum, and via Maxine, as we've said, but also to ensure that all schools are monitoring and encouraging families to take up the offer of free school meals, in a sense, because that is an indicator of this, as we know. So we need to be sure that the data on those who are applying is correct. As Councillor Fenton has said, we are all in some shape or form, I suppose, here have an interest in this and are involved in our communities. I, for example, have just come from Red Tower, where I am every Monday morning, and the disparate, if you like, communities, I think that's quite important. I think diversity has always been a passion of mine, which is why equalities is so important. I think we need to be sure that we're talking about the travelling community, that we've got other agencies and groups within the city that can help push this as well. I work closely with the mosque, for example, so I know that they will have their ways of knowing within the community, because we know that there are some families who wouldn't be going through the traditional route of applying or making themselves known, but actually do have, this morning, for example, quite a few families coming along who are collecting things, and I'm not convinced that they necessarily are on the radar, all of them. So it's doing our best to ensure that we are reaching all the people that are in need.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Right, can I move on therefore to the timetable, as it were, which the time scale starts on paragraph 28, and it then moves on to how we should tackle this in terms of timescales, with the recommendations can be made back to executive before remaining 2021-22 school holidays, and certainly before we go into 22-23 school year. Are we happy with this timescale? It's obviously pressured, but there's a lot to do, but it's a very important work to do. That's why the executive have asked us to tackle it.
I think it sounds, well, it's the best that it can be, I suppose, really. And there is pressure, because obviously we're talking about summer half term as well, which is very close to the 19th of May type date, as well as summer. So those particularly that half term in May, I think we need to bear that in mind, because the funding that we're talking about covers the Easter holidays, but we may all creep up very quickly.
Yes. We do have to bear in mind there's a need to have a draft final report to come back to CEC to endorse before it goes through executive. So that means finding another space for a CEC meeting before the executive meeting on 19th of May. So we have to get a slot in before then, and yes, certainly get moving. Any more thoughts between the two of you?
I think in looking at the timetable, if the executive meets on the 19th, you'd be looking at publication of papers for that. I don't know what day of the week the 19th is, 10th or 11th. So there need to be a CEC meeting late April, early May. We're currently on the cusp of the beginning of March. I reckon we've got about 5 weeks, and there's an Easter in the middle of that. So I think we probably need to be
cracking on.
Need to meet weekly, and I'd even suggest another meeting later this week to start divvying up tasks, and maybe for some of us individually to work with individual officers, and to one of us to look at some of the academic research that Polly mentioned, and pick out sort of pertinent information from that. So I think we're looking at 5 or 6 weeks tops to actually to do this, which is it's doable, but it's going to be quite a bit of work. But I'm sure we're up for that.
Yeah,
I'm sure we can. Yeah, Pauline, if you can get us that list of officers who can assist, and maybe the areas in which they can assist in, something like that would be very helpful to us to get going, get meetings in the diary and that type of thing.
I think around what Councillor Fenton's saying in terms of the academic research, that might be slightly wider than necessarily than our officers. I mean, would it not be that even though it's very tight, could we talk to somebody from Joseph Rowntree? Could we involve local people who've done work in
Have we? I think we might. Oh, she's back.
Sorry, it went up. I went into the waiting room apparently. Yeah.
I don't know what happened then, but
Sorry, I don't know if you heard what I said. I'm just wondering if I don't know what happened either. But
everyone disappeared.
yeah, just well on that academic research part, that might not necessarily be the role of officers to advise us on that, might it? We might have to come to our own judgments. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
it might be a question of being pointed to the appropriate direction by those who've kind of Joseph Rowntree Trust, of course.
Yeah.
Would be an ideal place to.
And the university, we've done work previously there with Professor Bradshaw when we've looked at food poverty. Councillor Fenton will remember that, I'm sure. That was only done a few years ago, about 2 years ago. So, I mean, there are experts within the city that will have done all the research, but we do need to, I think Councillor Fenton's absolutely right. We do need to refer to them.
Yes. Right. Any other comments before we come to a close? Pauline.
Thank you, Chair. Just a reminder that Ofsted is in. So whilst I might identify Maxine as one of those officers to support, we might have to recognise that it might be somebody else. And just in terms of family hubs, again, probably direction would be coming through from Children's. I think who led on the grant funding you were talking about, Councillor Fitzpatrick. So again, that they've got Ofsted in. I just need to be mindful of that over the next few weeks. So it may be that if there's anything you can front load with that doesn't impact on Children's, then recognise some of the other stuff might come later. But I'm happy to be conduit for anything that they can throw our way in the meantime.
Well, possibly Chair then, as I've said before, and Councillor Fenton mentioned, the academic framework or background, we could be working on that from external people, couldn't we? While we know that we've got Ofsted in
the council. Yeah. So that might be our first step, the academic background.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I think we can probably use emails now to get together and have a meeting and begin to sketch out a plan and a timescale to move forward. Would that be an approach you'd both welcome?
Yes.
Yep. Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Pauline, for that very comprehensive report, which I'm sure we'll be reading many, many times in the next few weeks.
Yes.
And that is concluding the meeting. Thank you all very much for attending and your contributions this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. And thank